With the construction of a new super canal in northern France, linking into the much older Canal du Nord, what is the history of this part of the Western Front, and how will this new canal change the landscape of the Great War? One of the things that I've learned in 4 decades of walking the old front line is how frequently the battlefields of the Western Front change. That landscape has changed so frequently in my own lifetime, and back in the day, talking to people like John Giles or Lynn MacDonald or Rose Coombs, they too had seen the landscape that they'd once known change and change again. Trenches and mine craters, little corners of a battlefield grubbed out and lost. And on one level, of course, it's understandable. Those who fought and died in the Great War fought for the liberty of those nations to be free, for the people of those nations to do as they will, and to build their houses and their roads and expand their communities is all part of that. And just this year I've seen changes on the battlefields. In the Somme, new tracks have been constructed around Fricourt, near the Triple Tambour mine craters and up on the high ground close to the Bois Français. Those changes have perhaps brought about benefits for visitors, enabled better access to those areas. And then at the same time, a listener to the podcast pointed me to the tree-lined avenue at La Ploudouve beneath the Messines Ridge, where the trees of that very evocative corner of Flanders Fields had been cut down, perhaps because of disease, perhaps to allow the access of new and bigger farming machinery. And while change is understandable and often welcomed, it can bring with it too a degree of sadness. And when we read about proposed change, I guess it can also bring about a degree of anticipation as to what that change may bring. And in the last couple of weeks, you may have seen on social media or in the newspapers that a new canal is about to be constructed in northern France, the Seine Nord Canal, which will extend some great distance from near to the city of Cambrai down towards Compiègne, close to Paris, linking up existing canal systems in that area and ones to the north and east and west to enable France to move more of its goods and products on canals rather than on roads. And that new Seine Nord Canal will link up with an extensive area of an existing canal called the Canal du Nord. And that is a name that immediately leaps off the pages of the history of the Great War. The battles on the Canal du Nord, the mention of the Canal du Nord in the histories of those last 2 years of the Great War of 1917 and 18 are prolific, and anyone who has studied any aspect of that phase of the fighting on the Western Front will have come across the name of this canal. It's a battle honour for many British and Commonwealth units, and it's a place covered not just in the history of the Great War, but in cemeteries and memorials, those beacons to the events that took place in that area of the Western Front during those years of the First World War. So with that in mind, with the idea of the Western Front being an ever-changing landscape, this gives us an opportunity in this podcast to talk about the Canal du Nord. What was the Canal du Nord? What were the battles on the Canal du Nord? What is the proposed project for the new canal, which will see the Seine Nord Canal become part of that Canal du Nord? And what are the potential issues that may arise from this in terms of the safeguarding of the commemoration and the history of the Great War and potential archaeology? If a project that's going to create a massive canal will dig across battlefields of heavy fighting in 1917 and 18, what will it find and how will that be dealt with? I wouldn't claim to have all of the answers to some of those questions, but we'll raise them here in this podcast, and I have a feeling in the coming years this is something that we may return to on quite a few occasions. So first of all, what was the Canal du Nord. The Canal du Nord, when we look at the whole map of northern France, it's crisscrossed with canals. Canals were the superhighways of the centuries of the past. If we go back to Flanders and we look at the importance of Ypres at the heart of the European cloth trade, it moved that cloth, which made it so rich and wealthy, on barges, on canals, linking up with other canal systems in other parts of Europe. And northern France, which is generally pretty flat, was suitable for the construction of canals, both to the west up towards the coast. But as engineering and technology changed, the rolling chalk downlands of the northeastern part of France also became places where canals could be constructed. The Saint-Quentin, the St. Quentin Canal, is another famous battlefield of the Great War, a much older canal than the Canal du Nord. The Canal du Nord was constructed in what we would call the Edwardian period, in that period leading up to the Great War. Construction began around 1908, onwards into a key period of 1913, and in that final year before the outbreak of war, the big engineering projects to construct the path of the canal, to construct the area where the locks would be, and indeed complete many of the locks, was nearing completion, but it was not finished. While some parts of the Canal du Nord did actually have water in and were functioning, much of it was still dry. So on the landscape, it looked like a massive ditch. Its aim during that construction period was to link that area of northern France near to Cambrai with the Oise Valley to the south, and also link it with the Escaut Canal and join up with the area around the Somme and the Somme Canal as well, creating a new modern canal system which, as I say, was really the superhighway of pre-war France. This was way before the construction of motorways, of course. Then the road system was largely cobbled roads or dirt roads, and canals offered a more efficient way of moving goods and material around through these waterways. And indeed, as the war moved on, both sides would implement those canals, those superhighways, within the infrastructure of their support mechanisms behind their lines. So the British used canals up towards the coast to move ammunition, equipment, food, war material, and also evacuate the wounded away from the battlefields. And the Germans did that to a certain extent as well, although not on the scale of the British with the creation of the inland water transport units of the Royal Engineers. Anyway, that's another subject in some respects. But this was the reason behind the construction of this canal, a piece of modern engineering work in the lead up to the Great War. But it wasn't finished when the war broke out. And as I say, if you'd have visited that ground, and if your armies marched across that ground as they did in the summer of 1914, as the Germans swept through the ground around Cambrai and met with French troops in many of the villages in that area, there were clashes between the French and the German armies in those early battles of the Great War, in the war of movement and manoeuvre, which was very much characteristic of those early months of the conflict. But by September of 1914, with those battles now over and the fight moving either to the ground around Paris or to the north, when the race to the sea began, the Canal du Nord was now in German-occupied territory. It was then in a position, as those battles of manoeuvre came to an end and the stalemate of the Western Front and the construction of the trench systems began, it was an area that found itself behind the German lines. An area where, although the construction had been brought to an end by the outbreak of war, the people in the villages that surrounded the Canal du Nord largely carried on their ordinary lives. The men had all gone off to fight for the French army, but the older men and the younger boys and the women remained in those villages in that area around Cambrai, behind the front, away from shell fire, carrying out their farming, working in the sugar factories, working in the lace factories of Cambrai, of which there were many at that time. Life still had a degree of normality despite the rumble of guns like thunder in the distance. And it would remain like that up to 1917, when the battles took place elsewhere in northern France or on the Somme, but the construction of what was known as the Hindenburg Line, an area that was spoken about in a previous podcast, and you go back through the catalogue to find the episode for that. The construction of the Hindenburg Line that ran right through this area where the Canal du Nord was located changed things completely. It turned the landscape that was behind the front into a defensive system, and the villagers were evacuated, displaced and moved to other parts of German-occupied France, and this then saw some of the great battles of 1917 and 1918. Although the canal hadn't been finished, it was, from the Germans' point of view, a great bonus, because a massive ditch constructed across an open rolling landscape like this in a time when tanks were now part of the battlefield created massive anti-tank ditches and obstacles to prevent any kind of Allied advance. And although the nearly 60 miles of the Canal du Nord were not complete, there were sections of it, such as the tunnel at Rualcourt, the vast escarpment, the vast cutting between the villages of Hermes and Havrincourt on what would become the Cambrai battlefields, and even the sections of the canal close to some of the main roads, like the Arras-Cambrai road, for example, created these obstacles which to a modern army equipped with modern weapons like tanks were considered to be formidable. So despite the construction of the trenches of the Hindenburg Line and the belts of wire and the bunkers and everything that made that, in the eyes of the Germans, an impregnable system of fortifications, the canal, a pre-existing feature on the landscape, became part of those very defences, an integral part, you may well argue. And when we go on to look at those battlefields of 1917-18, we see that the wide cuttings that were often over 100 foot wide and at least that deep, and then tunnels like the Rualcourt tunnel, which was 3 miles long, all of these feature in the ways that the Germans defend and the Allies attack. And come the end of the war in November 1918, this landscape, where the Canal du Nord ran for those 60 miles from northern France down towards the area beyond Péronne, was part of the Zone Rouge, the red zone, that area of total destruction. So the canal, not yet finished, was pretty much destroyed by the end of the conflict and had to be rebuilt again. And work on it was still continuing come the outbreak of a Second World War in 1939. And in May 1940, just as the German army had swept through that area of northern France in 1914, it did again with somewhat more lethality in many ways and more precision, with the German lightning war, the Blitzkrieg, with tanks and infantry and aircraft sweeping across this ground around Cambrai, with battles being fought again in the villages close to the city and up towards Arras and down to Péronne. And the Canal du Nord was once more fought over, and many of its bridges, reconstructed in the 1920s to allow normal life to continue, were destroyed once more, often by the Allies, whether that was British troops withdrawing or French and French colonial troops, all of whom fought in this area. So damage was done to the canal once again, and in 1944, as we jump on 4 years to the liberation of this area of northern France, as the Germans withdrew through here, and in this area to the north, British troops, but largely up towards Cambrai, American troops swept through here. The Germans blew the repaired bridges again. So bridge after bridge destroyed in the Great War, bridge after bridge rebuilt, destroyed at the beginning of the Second World War and towards the end of that conflict. The canal was in a dreadful state come the end of World War II, and it wasn't really properly opened for its original intent, its original purpose as this superhighway of canal boat after canal boat moving material and goods and everything else. It wasn't really open like that until the mid-1960s. So again, we kind of see the repercussions, the echoes of the Great War going right beyond 1918. So that's a bit of background to the history of the canal itself in terms of a construction. And we looked a little bit at what the history of it became as the Great War unfolded. But let's move on to the actual battles of 1917-18. So the Canal du Nord, as we've said, was pre-1917 an area behind the German lines. There are quite a lot of books of German photographs that were published of German units that were on the Somme and der Somme, Zwischen Arras and Peronne, two examples of them. They were photographic books that showed photographs of German units in the front line, different parts of the Somme battlefields, but also photographed their rear echelon, their rear areas, their areas behind the lines. And the Canal du Nord features in both of those books quite extensively because it was a place close to the villages where German soldiers were billeted. But with the construction of the Hindenburg Line and that decision at the end of the Battle of the Somme by the Germans to withdraw from the Somme area back to some pre-prepared defences, to sit tight in those, and that led to the construction of what they called the Siegfriedstellung and what we thought was called the Hindenburgstellung, which became the Hindenburg Line. That saw the landscape, as we've said, around the Canal du Nord become a defensive position, not just a place where there were open farm fields and quiet villages cut by an unfinished canal. This was now part of a new German line. And then in early 1917, the Germans withdrew from the Somme front, pulled back into the Hindenburg Line, and the area of the Canal du Nord became part of that front line area, but not all of it. So to the south, near to Peronne, for example, that part of the Canal du Nord was now behind the British lines. And during that withdrawal to the Hindenburg Line period, British troops first encountered the Canal du Nord by crossing it at various points. Think of those moments portrayed in the film 1917 when they have to cross a canal. That is depicting British units crossing the Canal du Nord in the areas where the Germans have given up that ground. They've blown the bridges, they've blown mines at the crossroads, cut down the trees on the main roads that crisscross this part of the landscape, and the canal is an obstacle to the movement of Allied troops, British and Commonwealth troops, up towards those new German defences on the Hindenburg Line. And it's strange to think that the canal ran from behind the German lines through parts of it close to the very front line itself, and then down towards Peronne, where it was then behind the British front line. But because it was not a functioning canal, I guess that's how this was possible. And while the initial encounters on the Hindenburg Line by British and Commonwealth troops to the south, for example, close to Saint-Quentin, took them nowhere near that part of the Canal du Nord, and in the area around Peronne, the Germans just simply gave up the ground and pulled back to the full Hindenburg positions beyond that area, of which the Canal du Nord's sections were then behind those front-line positions. Fighting on the Canal du Nord itself would not take place until the Battle of Cambrai in November of 1917. And in that battle, with the troops in that area given a free hand to choose the grounds of their assault to enable tanks to truly display what they were capable of doing, and the implementation of hundreds of tanks advancing on the German Hindenburg Line defences. The battles on the Hindenburg Line had begun with the Battle of Arras in April of 1917, had proved that the Hindenburg Line was far from impregnable, but at Cambrai this was taken really to a new level, with the tanks cooperating with the infantry and to a degree cooperating with aircraft, and the artillery saw the beginnings of the orchestration of the army to become a modern fighting formation that would then lead to the battles, the great battles of 1918 and the victory on the Western Front. But Cambrai in November 1917 saw the first true fighting over those key areas of the Canal du Nord. And indeed that vast ditch of the dry canal did prove to be a significant obstacle for the tanks. The huge fascines, the brushwood that was chained together on top of the tank could be dropped into obstacles to enable the tanks to move over, had to be employed to get the tanks down the side of the canal, across the canal, then up the other side to give them some traction to get up there and cross that obstacle. So it proved indeed to be an important part of those defences of the Hindenburg Line. And when the advance at Cambrai broke down and the Germans counterattacked and pushed the British forces right back, often taking more territory than they'd had at the beginning of the battle, particularly in the northern area. And there's some pretty heavy fighting along different parts of the canal, particularly around the areas where there were bridges. Bridges destroyed had been repaired by the engineers to create footbridges or tank bridges in some cases, and there was fighting around those. Ernst Junger, for example, Storm of Steel, that classic German memoir of the First World War, he was in action near Mervre, for example, taking a point across the Canal du Nord. There's a good account of that in his book. So in the winter of 1917-18, following that Battle of Cambrai, the front line settled down around the area of the Canal du Nord. But then in March 1918, the Germans attacked on a wide front on the Fifth Army front, pushed the British Army back, and in the area to the north where the Canal du Nord was located, that front collapsed as well, and the line was pushed back much closer to Arras, for example, in the very northern area. And the sections of the canal that had been taken by the British in the advance to the Hindenburg Line, as they called it, were then retaken by the Germans. So in that area around Peronne, for example, the canal at places like Etricourt, Manencourt, that was retaken by the Germans. There's a deep cutting there as well, near to the Roualcourt tunnel, and there's a British cemetery close to that site, which has got quite a lot of March 1918 graves in it. And the Germans pushed through along that road, advancing north of Peronne back towards the old Somme 1916 battlefields, and there was fighting in that area then. So it became a battlefield once more. But now, following that German offensive, the Kaiserschlacht, which pushed the British and Commonwealth forces right back, reclaimed all that ground around Peronne and beyond towards the 1916 Somme battlefields. Albert was taken, and then to the south, the Germans pushed hard against Amiens until they were stopped at Villers-Bretonneux by the Australians. This meant the Canal du Nord area and those trenches of the Hindenburg Line were now behind the German front. But although the Germans, in all of their offensives in 1918, broke through and took vast amounts of ground, they did so at a very high cost, a cost that was increasingly impossible for them to repair or replace. Manpower was a great problem for the German army, which is why they called up younger and younger soldiers in that last period of the Great War on the Western Front. So on the 8th of August 1918, with the Battle of Amiens, that was the black day of the German army, the breakthrough of Allied forces on the Somme, the French to the south, and then Canadians and Australians and British on the northern part of the Somme battlefield, and the collapse of the German line and the pushback across that ground once more. We can see how the front swung like a pendulum backwards and forwards across these bits of the Somme and the Pas-de-Calais and the area around Peronne, Bapaume, up towards Arras and Cambrai. And once more, British and Commonwealth forces found themselves facing the Hindenburg Line and facing the Canal du Nord, leading to the actual Battle of the Canal du Nord, a single battle that was named after the canal in September and October of 1918. So that battle, the Battle of the Canal du Nord, a battle honour seen on the regimental colours of many British and Commonwealth regiments, began on the 27th of September 1918 and involved the men of the Canadian Corps. Arthur Currie, who was now commanding the Corps and had been since 1917 following the Battle of Vimy Ridge, when the original Corps commander, Julian Byng, had been promoted to army level. Currie had then taken over and fought with the Canadian Corps as its commander from the battles of Hill 70 through Passchendaele, the operations in early 1918, and then the breakout on the Somme. And the Canadians would find themselves in those last 100 days of the Great War fighting almost continuously for every single day from the 8th of August until the last day of the war on the 11th of November 1918. And those 4 Canadian divisions that made up the Corps found themselves fighting something like 50-odd German divisions during that period, an unparalleled amount of combat for one single formation. And the Canadians paid the price for that with the tens of thousands of casualties that they were suffering each month as they broke through the Somme, broke through the Hindenburg Line, and found themselves here on the Canal du Nord. And this battle involving Currie's troops was really one of the triumphs of the Canadian Corps under his leadership in the Great War. Like Vimy, 4 Canadian divisions attacked side by side. Not every unit in the division, but nevertheless elements from all 4 Canadian divisions were involved. They attacked on a much narrower front than Vimy, only about 2,500 yards. And this was typical of many of the battles of this period, where you put a lot of resources into one part of the line, punch a hole through that line, sweep into the hinterland beyond and roll up those defences. This bite and hold tactic that had been developed in the previous year was now being refined more and more as the Allied armies pushed forward. And the role of engineers in this operation was crucial. One of the strengths of the Canadian divisions in this last 100 days of the war is the amount of engineering troops they had in their divisions compared to British ones that enabled them to carry out key battlefield engineering tasks to enable their troops and their tanks and their guns and their ammunition limbers all to move forward. So when smashed ground was taken, the engineers would be out repairing the road, repairing the bridges, putting up new bridges and enabling the infrastructure to catch up with the advancing troops to keep them fed with the bombs, the bullets and the bully beef and everything else that was needed to keep them in the field. And you see a lot of photographs of this Battle of Canal du Nord in 1918 showing Canadian engineers working on breaching the obstacles of the dry ditch, repairing the bridges and building new bridges. But not just the Canadians and New Zealanders. The New Zealand Tunnelling Company of the New Zealand Engineers built a massive bridge across the deep cutting between Hermes and Havrincourt. And we'll put some pictures of all this onto the podcast website so you can get a sense of what the canal looked like, its size and some of these engineering projects that were carried out on it. So Currie's plan to punch a hole in the German Hindenburg line and the defences around the Canal du Nord proved highly successful, with the increased orchestration, as we've used that phrase a lot, which it's a good way of describing it, of the tanks and the guns and the infantry and the aircraft all working together in a modern way, in a modern battle to defeat the enemy ahead of them, enabled him to cross the Canal du Nord, advance on the village of Bourlon and beyond it Bourlon Wood, and sweep the ground up in the approach to the city of Cambrai. Currie himself thought that this was one of the greatest achievements of his men, and I've read that when it came to the placement of a national monument to commemorate Canada, which of course became what we now know at Vimy Ridge, he was of the opinion that really it should be here. And while Canadians today very much obsess about Vimy Ridge, they know a lot less about the Battle of the Canal du Nord and Bourlon Wood and the fighting around Cambrai in 1918, which is a great shame. So when we examine battles like that on the Canal du Nord in September and October of 1918 involving the Canadian Corps and the British units attached to them, and we go back through those previous 2 years of fighting here, it's not surprising that we find so many of the beacons of the Great War, the silent cities, on this landscape today, those British and Commonwealth cemeteries. So that's the background and the history of the fighting on the Canal du Nord. What of this new Seine-Nord Canal? How does that affect the Canal du Nord? And how are we likely to see it affect the landscape of the Western Front of the Great War in this part of those battlefields? We've had the history. What of the new canal? How does this canal affect the area of the battlefields, and how does it weave into the existing area of the Canal du Nord, that name so famous with the battles of the Great War? The new canal, called the Seine-Nord Canal, is a project that I remember first reading about when I was living in France in the 1990s. It's not really a new project. Government after government have kind of kicked it down the road, and the cost of it was so high that some governments swerved away from it. But it seems to have come back for all kinds of reasons that are being driven forward by many nations wanting to up their green credentials with climate change in mind. And the canal is an attempt to move vehicles off of the road and unclog some of the main motorways of northern France, and move the goods that are transported by lorry onto the canals and be moving them by barge, just as in centuries past. So they become the new superhighways of a modern France. And to do this in the volume that is required, it's not just about updating the Canal du Nord, it is constructing this new Seine-Nord canal to become, as I've used the phrase, a super canal, much, much wider, deeper, to enable the movement of a large amount of traffic up and down this canal and link up into the other canal systems that surround it. The new project is being broken up into 4 sections, and there's a website for this, and we'll put a link to that website on the podcast website so you can go on there and check it out. It is available in English as well as French, although some parts of it are still only in French, but you can run that through translators now and the meaning of it is pretty clear. The map sections give you an idea of the exact path, the exact route of this canal, so you can see that's useful for that. But when we look at the 4 sectors, there are 2 northern sectors that run from the village of Aubencheul-au-Bac across to Havrincourt and Ytre and down to Péronne, so cutting through 2 separate départements, counties, the Nord-Pas-de-Calais and then down to the Somme, and then 2 southern sectors that run from the ground south of Péronne via Nesle, via Nesle as the troops called it, and Noyon down towards Compiègne in the next department of the Oise north of Paris, and again linking up into the canal systems that are in that area and the logistics hubs that are in that area as well. There will be a whole host of new constructions. They'll obviously widen the canal, deepen the canal, build new sections of the canal to link the new Seine-Nord with parts of the existing Canal du Nord. There'll be new locks that will be built in parts of the canal. Bridges will be built to cross the motorways, because it will cross 2 of France's significant motorways in this area, the A1 to Paris and the A26 down to Reims. So that will see the construction of a bridge to take the canal over the motorway. So I'm sure they're looking to minimise the blockage and the prevention of movement of traffic along those motorways during that construction period, although I'm sure there will be some closures at some point. There'll be rail bridges as well for the same purpose, and canal basins and logistics areas for the unloading of the goods will be built, obviously then enlarging the area where there's water in different parts, and there's one of those due to be constructed, for example, at Cléry-sur-Somme, close to Péronne. Around the canal there will be port facilities built for the unloading of supplies and material and goods, and then hubs to take those goods onwards to their destination, whether it's supermarché, whether it's supermarkets or factories or warehouses or whatever that is located. So it's a huge building project, even beyond the actual construction of the canal itself. And when we consider that the main work on the actual canal will widen and deepen it, it will mean that the landscape there will change. It will destroy, remove, swallow up areas of northern France in its expansion and its construction. And although there are plans to environmentally return the areas around the canal to something that they were before, there will be damage that cannot be undone during the construction of this canal and the way it will change the landscape. The deep cuttings that date back to the original parts of the Canal du Nord at places like Hermies and Havrincourt and near to Étricourt, Manencourt, they will change forever because they will need to be widened, changed, maybe even levelled out. I'm not really sure from the plans what the intention is there. Not all of this, I don't think, is as yet clear, the exact impact it will have on parts of the landscape. And when you think that those cuttings, photographed as they were extensively by both sides in the Great War, the scene of fighting and engineering projects done by military engineers in the Great War that was such an important part of the outcome of those battles, all of that will most certainly change forever. It will also cut across existing road systems. So when we look at some of the wartime maps and we see how little the road systems and the layout of the landscape has changed, that will definitely change as a consequence of this. I mean, we've seen it with other roads. There's a ring road around Albert, around Bapaume. There are many new roads on different parts of the battlefields, not just on the British part of the Western Front. When we go down into the French sectors, the construction of TGV lines, motorways, all that kind of stuff has changed the landscape. This is understandably a part of development in the modern world, but it is something that we have to consider when we look at what this project, how it will impact the battlefields as we know them now. And what the work will result in is this new canal, this super canal, which is 107 kilometres long, 54 metres wide and 4.5 metres deep. The websites that details the construction and the plans for it says it will cut through, in effect, 64 separate communes from the northern area close to Cambrai right down towards Compiègne via Péronne. And its aim, the purpose of it, is, as we've said, to move traffic off the roads and put goods onto the canal. But its purpose is to move 15 million tonnes of goods, to remove more than 1 million lorries off of the road of France. So that's the background to it, and that's the kind of changes that will take place in this area. Quite substantial changes when you think that a canal that will be 54 metres wide, a much bigger area around that will be affected during the construction phase. So to get vehicles in there, the diggers and the lorries and the tippers and everything else, a much wider area than just those 54 metres will be affected by the physical construction of this new canal and the expansion of the existing Canal du Nord. So it's clear that it's going to have a big impact on this part of the Western Front landscape. Now, I want to make it clear this is not NIMBYism, as we call it in Britain, on my part, not in my backyard NIMBYism. Far from it. The removal of more than 1 million lorries off of the roads of France, to me, is a very good thing. And the construction of this canal will give work, employment, jobs, create wealth in the area, but also, of course, it will undoubtedly change the area as well. And it's that we're kind of looking at now, I think, in this podcast, or moving on to look at, because it's about archaeology. We've spoken about Great War archaeology many times on this podcast and will continue to do so. It's such an important part of our understanding of the landscape of the Great War. That phrase that the Belgians have developed, that the landscape is the last witness, with the generation that served and fought and experienced the Great War, with them having gone, our last witness is the landscape itself. And what we will see with the construction of this canal is that landscape giving up its secrets once more. That's no surprise. If you construct something this big across an area where there was intensive fighting for 2 years of the Great War, in periods of the conflict when the bombardments, the amount of artillery shells that were used, were at their kind of pinnacle in many respects, because artillery was throughout the war the king and queen of the battlefield, but particularly so in those 1918 battles, and that within that ordnance that was dropped there would be a percentage that never went off, and that they will find everything from high explosive to shrapnel to phosphorus to gas to Livens projectors with liquid fire inside them and everything else. They will find all of this during the construction of it. So the archaeology will play an important role in this, and archaeology is going to be very much part of this project, partly because it will cut through an area of rich Gallo-Roman remains, so much earlier periods of archaeology, but of course conflict archaeologists will be a part of this in dealing with the archaeology of the Great War that will be found, and possibly even some of the archaeology of the Second World War, given the fighting along the canal in 1940 and a bit in 1944, but much more of it at the beginning of the Second World War. And it won't be just the material artifacts that these archaeologists will be brought in to uncover, record, take away, examine. It will be the human remains, the human fragments, the human archaeology that will be uncovered during the construction phase. And that led to a press release by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission recently detailing their plans in the approach to this project beginning. And the Commission is building a new extension to one of its existing cemeteries. We saw with the discovery and retrieval and identification of Australian soldiers at Fromelles some years ago, the construction of Pheasant Wood Cemetery, the first Great War cemetery constructed since September 1938, when the final cemetery and memorial at Villers-Bressanaux was made. And rather than build a brand new cemetery, perhaps close to the Canal du Nord, they've chosen Lewes British Cemetery, an existing First World War cemetery, and they've been given ground there to construct a new extension. And this is being built not just for the Canal du Nord project. You may have read about the construction of a hospital at Lens, and there have been human remains, British and Commonwealth, found there, including quite a lot of Canadian soldiers. They will be reburied in this new extension, but ground has been put aside for the recovery of hundreds, potentially hundreds, of British and Commonwealth soldiers from this area of the Canal du Nord and the Seine-Nord Canal construction site. And the kind of figures that they're putting on it is potentially as many as 700 human remains. I mean, it is impossible to say how many soldiers will be found during this construction. And although the Commission are talking about 700 remains here, their website says that the new extension will support the reburial of perhaps as many as 1,200 soldiers from Britain and the Commonwealth. And on top of this, of course, I mean, we're just discussing British and Commonwealth reburials here. During this construction, the bodies of German and French soldiers will also be found, perhaps even American soldiers from some of the 1918 battles, although there were some American engineers in this area in 1917. Some of their first casualties were in that Cambrai area when they found themselves attached to the British forces during that kind of training period before the American Expeditionary Force was properly employed or deployed elsewhere on the Western Front. So we're looking potentially at the recovery of remains of men from many, many different nations and many stakeholders and battlefield partners, we could describe them as, being involved in this. So not just the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, but the Volksbund, the German War Graves Commission, Souvenirs Français and the French government for the recovery of their dead. And if the Americans are found, then the American Battlefield Monuments Commission as well. So all of these people will be involved. And there appears to be the early stages of the construction of a kind of working party to oversee all of this, which is very, very encouraging. This is being taken very seriously by the Commission, and resources are being put aside for it, because it won't just be the recovery of human remains and saying, yep, he's definitely British and Commonwealth, we'll put him in Lewes. It will be much more than that, as we've seen with recent archaeology of the Great War, where the MOD war detectives are involved in this and various others to identify these soldiers using modern methods, including DNA. So it's going to be a very interesting period to see the largest recovery of dead from the Great War since the interwar period, when the battlefields were cleared and the period of expansion and rebuilding took place in that post-war period. We're now, with this new civil engineering project, the Seine-Nord Canal, seeing potentially unparalleled levels of human remains from the Great War being not just recovered, but identified as well and buried in marked, named graves. So again, we often say it here on the podcast, the last page of the history of the Great War will never be turned. And I think with this canal, with the expansion of the Canal du Nord and the building of the new one, we're going to see even more pages of our understanding and history of the Great War added to. And that is an interesting aspect of this whole project. And I'm sure, and the press reporting of it, I'm sure will enable this. I think we will see more of an awareness of this part of the Western Front landscape. It doesn't get the same level of visitors as the Somme or Ypres or Vimy Ridge and places like that. Perhaps it will increase awareness, increase visitors, increase understanding, and that when we look at the cemeteries around the area of the Canal du Nord, and when you look at the proposed route, none of the cemeteries or memorials appear to be affected by the actual route itself. Some of them will be pretty close to the finished canal, but they're not going to be ploughed up. I remember some years ago, one of the early British press reportings of this was something along the lines of, and you can guess potentially which newspapers it may have been, the French will dig up our brave boys, something along those kind of lines. That isn't going to happen. What's being done here is a construction that's being built to take into account of existing things like the cemeteries and memorials, as well as civil buildings and people's houses and farms and everything else. But it's also being done sympathetically to properly recover the dead, and eventually through organisations like the Commonwealth War Graves Commission hopefully identify some of those again. And who knows what they will find, considering that in 1998 a tank was dug up in a field near Flesquier, Deborah, which is now in the museum there. Who knows what they'll find? Maybe they will find some tanks from the Great War. Who knows? It is potentially a fascinating and interesting period that we have ahead of us when construction begins here in 2024 into 2025. And like I say, I'm sure it's something we'll return to in the podcast again. But just kind of thinking ahead, we'll end the podcast with a little section looking at a few key little areas along the Canal du Nord and thinking about how they may change and how that might change our understanding and our connection to that part of the landscape of the Great War. We're not going to attempt Canal du Nord in a day kind of thing here, but I just wanted to highlight a few areas along the Canal du Nord where the new canal is going to be built and how that might change and what there is to see. And perhaps this will encourage some of you to go there before the construction work begins, so you can experience the landscape as it is now and then eventually contrast that to what we'll see when the project is over. There's no clear idea of how many years it will take to build this canal, but I'm guessing it's going to be a fair few. So when we go up into that northern area of the canal, near to where the new construction will begin at Auban-sur-l'Aubac, that brings us down into the ground which was very much at the tip of the spear of Arthur Currie's Canadian Corps assault on the Battle of the Canal du Nord in September of 1918, in the crossing of the canal and the advance on Bourlon and Bourlon Wood. And what's really interesting in this area is the large number of battlefield cemeteries created by the Canadian Corps, where you can almost step by step, beacon by beacon, follow the advance of the Canadians through this ground. And you can take it all the way back, actually, to the outskirts of Arras, with places like Orange Hill near Monchy-le-Preux, with the Canadian burials there, then right through the DQ line, the Drocourt-Quéant switch line, and then up to the advance on the main Hindenburg line area here around the Canal du Nord, and indeed beyond this as well. But certainly in this area there's a lot of small battlefield cemeteries which are largely, or even in some cases wholly, Canadian. So there's that to see. And at Merv there is the bridge where Ernst Junger led his men across and took on the British forces from the London Territorials who were defending that ground, portrayed in his book Storm of Steel. All of this can be connected up, and there are some very good guidebooks to this area of the battlefield, and again we'll put some links to those onto the podcast website. But one of the areas that I particularly enjoy visiting, which I first went to many years ago, is one section of the Canal du Nord where the Guards Division made their attack across that canal just to the south of where the Canadians were in September of 1918. Lord Gort, who would go on to command the British Expeditionary Force in the Phoney War 39-40, then the Battle of France and the withdrawal to Dunkirk, he served here as a young Guards officer and carried out an attack on the German positions here that resulted in the award of the Victoria Cross. So you've got that. He survived, of course, went on to high command a generation later. But there's one little area beneath a small battlefield cemetery called Sanders Keep Cemetery that overlooks a part of the canal and a bridge over that canal, where the bridge had been blown in 1918, but the two stanchions of the bridge, the two ramps, the brickwork ramps, had been turned into defensive positions where there were machine guns. And here, men of the 1st Coldstream Guards crossed this section of the Canal du Nord, resulting in the award of 2 Victoria Crosses. And when the dead were cleared from this part of the battlefield, they were brought by the Guards Division burial officer to be buried here at Saunders Keep on the ground beyond the canal where the German defensive lines were located. And there are some mounds in the field here which I'm pretty sure cover up bunkers that were part of those defences. You can see them quite clearly when you walk up the slope towards the cemetery itself. And considering the number of concrete structures that were built around the Canal du Nord, that, I would guess, is another part of the Great War archaeology that they're going to be finding on a regular basis when this canal is constructed. But when you come up to the cemetery and walk in through the gate and see the rows of headstones, there's only 142 burials here, so it's quite a small battlefield cemetery. You see it's dominated by the Guards, and in particular those men of the 1st Coldstream Guards who were killed in the crossing where the bridge is on the 27th of September 1918. And among them is one of those 2 VC recipients, Lance Corporal Thomas Norman Jackson, VC, of the 1st Battalion Coldstream Guards, who was killed in action on that day, 27th of September 1918, aged 21. He was from Swinton, which is a small village near to Rotherham here in South Yorkshire, just up the road from me, a place I've been to on many, many occasions. There's a cross of sacrifice that forms the war memorial there, where his name is engraved. There's one of those VC plaques that were constructed during the centenary laid there as well. He worked on the local railways and the station at Swinton. He worked there, and there's a plaque to the railway workers in Sheffield on which he's commemorated. So he's very well known in this part of South Yorkshire. And he went into action with his captain in the attack on that area around the bridge, Captain Cyril Frisby, who was also awarded the Victoria Cross. He survived the action, whereas Jackson was killed as a posthumous award. And when Frisby went to the palace subsequently at the investiture of his Victoria Cross, he met with Jackson's parents, his family, and was able to tell them the story of just how brave their son had been in this attack here on the Canal du Nord and the Hindenburg Line in September of 1918. So here this landscape is pretty much unchanged. The layout of the landscape, the placement of the cemetery as a beacon to the fighting here in 1918, the dead, like Jackson, lying there overlooking the ground that they'd captured. And although the bridge was destroyed and that bit of the canal was rebuilt, it's pretty much really looking as it was in 1918. But of course all of that will change as a consequence of this. And I put a map of these locations onto the podcast website so you can see where they are. We've also not far away got the deep cutting in that area between the village of Hermes and Havrincourt. This was an area just behind the British lines at the beginning of the Battle of Cambrai in November of 1917. And it's quite interesting when you take that road from Hermes. There's a couple of cemeteries. The Boy General is buried in Hermes, Brigadier General Roland Boys Bradford, who was a VC recipient from the Battle of the Somme, commanding 9th Battalion Diamond Line Infantry in the fighting between Eau Corps and the Butte de Wallon Corps, and then he died of wounds received in Boulogne Wood. We've mentioned him, I think, in a couple of times in previous podcasts. He's buried in Hermes. But as you come out of the rebuilt village of Hermes, head towards Havrincourt, you get to a little building just overlooking the canal, which for many years was a scrap yard, a scrap metal merchant, which was a great little spot to go to. I've bought German helmets in there and all kinds of paraphernalia that has been brought in by farmers and which he used to sell really just for their scrap value. No longer, I would add. And then you get to the bridge. There's a double bridge there. And going along there sometimes in a coach and not saying anything until we're on the bridge, people audibly gasp as we go over that, because the cutting there is phenomenally deep. It's a sheer, steep cutting right down to the canal, a couple of 100 feet below, I would guess. And you can see what an obstacle potentially it was. And there had been a bridge here. The Germans had blown it, so the engineers had to put another bridge in. And the bridge was built, rebuilt quite a few times during the Great War. The Germans had put a railway bridge across a section of this at one point. And then during the Battle of the Canal du Nord in September 1918, the tunnelling company of the New Zealand engineers came up and they built a special bridge was constructed because the cutting here was something like 180 feet across, and the existing bridges that they had were not wide enough, so they couldn't build a bridge and then push it across because the far end of it was short of where the gap in the crossing was. So they had to bolt together two existing bridges and then push them across, opening up this road again, enabling the movement of guns, equipment, lorries, supplies, limbers, mules, everything else, probably tanks as well, and opening up that front as the Canadians pushed through and continued with their advance beyond this section of the Canal du Nord. And there's quite a lot of photographs. And again, I've mentioned this previously, but I've put some photographs of this onto the podcast website. Now, that deep cutting, and it really is something to go there and park up near where the scrap metal merchant man was, park up there, and then walk onto the bridge and kind of look down. No good if you suffer from vertigo, because it is quite a drop there, but it's a very impressive location, an incredible bit of pre-First World War engineering, and quite how they will change and adapt this for the new canal, I'm not entirely sure. Whether they'll go round it and build another section further away, I'm not entirely sure, but I'm not sure if there's enough of a gap to do that between where this cutting is and the villages of Hermes and Havrincourt. I guess we'll see in due course, but it's certain that this part of the landscape will change whatever. So again, it's perhaps a good idea to come and see these places pretty much as they were in their 1918 environment. You can imagine the engineers doing their crossing here. Come and see them now before they change forever. And we could go on. We could talk about so many other areas where the Canal du Nord ran and the battles that took place there in 1917 and 1918, the defence of the ground by British troops in March of 1918. We haven't really touched much on that. And places like Etricourt, Manincourt, where they defended the roads that approached the beginnings of those old Somme 1916 battlefields. And you wonder if in the back of your mind that the men defending that ground thought of their comrades who'd laid down their lives nearly 2 years before on the Somme and were desperate to stem the tide of the German advance, but also mindful of the sacrifice that lay behind them, quite literally, both in terms of the timeline and the geography of the ground where they were. But we could go on talking about so many places, and this is a landscape that will change. The history will never change. The events that unfolded there, nothing can erase that. And when we look at the landscape of the Great War and the way it has changed, we have to accept that these changes do take place. This is not a frivolous engineering task just to build some kind of vanity project. This is essential for the infrastructure of France, and that is what men in both world wars were fighting for the liberty, as we've said, the liberty of nations to decide their own true course. But I think it makes us also reflect. The landscape, which we speak so much of here on the Old Front Line podcast, is so essential to our understanding, our connection. And it's so important that we get it right in the way that we deal with it. And it looks on the surface as if this project, in its early stages anyway, really will do that, particularly in the recovery of the dead. Because change can be good as well as bad. And the battlefields never remain the same. What we see of that landscape today is nothing like the landscape of November 1918, when the whole of the Western Front was laid waste after 4 years of constant war. But the landscape has this meaning. We walk it, we follow it, we seek its beacons, whether memorials or cemeteries. We seek to connect to it, connect and understand that wider landscape, that wider history of the Old Front Line. You've been listening to an episode of The Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. You can follow me on Twitter at Somcor. You can follow the podcast at Old Frontline Pod. Check out the website at oldfrontline.co.uk, where you'll find lots of podcast extras and photographs and links to books that are mentioned in the podcast. And if you feel like supporting us, you can go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/oldfrontline, or support us on Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/oldfrontline. Links to all of these are on our website. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon.